Welcome back to the Scarlet Faithful podcast. I'm Aaron Brightman, welcoming back David Anderson to discuss bowl-bound Rutgers football after the dominant win over Indiana 31-14 this past Saturday. Lots to talk about. David, initially just your reaction on Rutgers taking care of business, winning in Indiana, and becoming bowl eligible for the first time since 2014.
Well, first of all, it's a huge relief to those of us who have spent so much of our time and effort. I was just thinking about joking with you when you first asked me that to just say, oh, we're not just talking about signing day, because most of the time when we reach the bye week, whether it's week 5, 6, 7, 8, whenever, that's what we're talking about. I mean, we're already on week 9,
Yeah.
and that's not what we're talking about. So that's a good sign. But it's more just relief, happiness for a lot of the players that have, and coaches too, obviously. But it's a little different for a coach who's done this before than a player who this is the first taste of, sustained success that they've had at the college level. So it's more of that than anything else. But then it's also uh, surprise that they've been able to, in effect, skip, let's call it half a step in the rebuilding process. And that half a step being winning close games against, inferior competition. They've put most of these out of reach in the third or early fourth quarters. I mean, they've only won one close game all season. The rest have been pretty much under their control for most of the second half. So that is probably as an encouraging sign as possible. We'll probably talk about this throughout as a theme, but I don't think that is a mirage. Because the way this team is built is not that this is just a flash in the pan and we're going to regress to some sort of other mean. Like they're winning these games convincingly, and there's really no question who's the better team at the end, other than, like I said, maybe last week against Michigan State. But every other game, they've left no doubt.
Yeah, very good point. It is impressive that, first of all, Rutgers has been favored in 6 games this season, which on its own is kind of crazy. They've won all 6 of them, 5 of them by double digits, covered 5 of them. So, I mean, just like all of that together, if you take a step back and remember where we were at going into the season, if you had said that, I mean, you would have. It's pretty incredible if you think about it, just in terms of where this program has been over the last decade.
For sure. I think that kind of we talked about this over and over and over again. A lot of it comes down to timing. Like, for example, and they haven't had every single thing break right. I mean, when you look at it, Northwestern, the time to play them is now because Ben Bryant is out. Rutgers played them probably not at their worst, which is what Minnesota basically did when Northwestern had Bryant throwing the ball, checking around. They had some confidence. Rutgers played them before they had everything put together. So they played Northwestern not the best time, not the worst time. They played Michigan State probably at the best time to play against them because their coaching staff, their confidence, things like that. Wisconsin, they played maybe at the worst time as they were getting better and Mordecai was still healthy. So not every single thing has broken right, but they still have been able to win these games. And then, if you want to talk more micro level with timing, I mean, we just received the news Tyreem Powell likely out for the season. And you used to have to say to yourself, okay, if that happened 2 weeks ago, would we be having a completely different conversation about this team? Probably not, because they were able to win even though he was ejected in the second half against Michigan State. They shut them out even with him off the field in the second, at the end of the second half. I guess they scored the first drive, right? But then for most of the second half, they held him scoreless. So whereas conversely, when you look at Indiana, once their 2 safeties were out, and I think the biggest difference in the game to me was they had 2 of their best 3 players, at least 2 of their best 4 defensive players were those 2 safeties. One got injured and one got ejected. And once that happened, they didn't have the depth to weather that storm. Their safeties were playing too far back because they were afraid of kind of taking a bad angle, like we saw Virginia Tech do, especially like we saw some other teams on the schedule do. But instead, Rutgers was able to just get 5 yards a pop, 3 yards a pop, 4 yards a pop when they needed it. And then the one time that Indiana over pursued, Gavin Wimsatt popped an 80-yard touchdown to ice the game, basically. So Rutgers has weathered storms that their opponents have not. And so that's probably the most encouraging, is that things are not breaking perfectly, but Rutgers is seizing those opportunities. So, I mean, your thoughts on just timing of some of these things happening, or just the opportunities that we keep harping on that they're taking advantage of.
Yeah, I mean, it's just been great to see the fact that, I mean, my biggest reason for skepticism going into the season is that it's very rare in which a team, wins all their matchup games, wins all their 50-50 games, is able to come through in every opportunity in which they have a realistic chance. And the fact that they've done that has been really remarkable. Obviously, depth moving forward is a huge concern, in terms of them being able to. They've been fortunate. They haven't been perfect, like you said. I mean, Chris Long was a loss at wide receiver. I think Renee Conga's been a loss at defensive line. I think it's a bigger question mark now in terms of when he might return, with Powell out. So yeah, timing is obviously a huge part of it. And again, also a negative was that they played their last 3 games were against teams that either came off a bye or just had their bye. So they had that going against them too. So yes, it hasn't been perfect. So to see them be able to win every game they should have, or had a very reasonable chance to do it. I do think it goes back to, and it's cliche maybe, but culture, leadership, experience. And it's like this team is just very steady, and they haven't. They haven't been extreme in the sense of they don't get too high, they don't get too low, and that even goes with their play, right? I mean, they're not the most explosive team in the world, but they don't make a lot of mistakes either. So I just think their whole kind of aura is very balanced, and we've seen that play out.
For sure. I mean, I think that one of the things that we've been kind of pleasantly surprised by, not just in terms of breaks and timing on the field, is that usually when a team overperforms at this point, I say overperform, it's kind of a loose term because there's scenarios where they could be 6-2 right now, or even a good 5-3, where games were more close, or they got lucky, another team's quarterback got hurt, like during the game final drive or something. Like, they haven't had those type of things happen.
True.
So how is this working? And the answer is, well, they are building things that are more of a sustainable foundation that can breed sustainable success.
Mm-hmm.
So you were mentioning offline, they didn't take the Michigan State model where, they plugged a bunch of holes and then had this awesome season. But then a season later, which in their case was last year into this year, you were seeing cracks like right away, even though they had such a good year 2 years ago. It doesn't seem like that's where Rutgers is right now because, like we said, they've been able to weather those minor injuries. And when we look at it, there's no player outside of maybe Kyle Monangai, maybe Flip Dixon, that has completely exceeded our expectations. And the interesting thing with Monangai is it's really two parts. One is he was not a great blocker before. You can say he was, that's not true. Like, I think he was a willing blocker before, but he has improved both, his physical prowess, which I think has helped, as well as maybe some of his tenacity. I'm not sure what it is, but he's effective as a blocker in the run and pass game, which allows him to be a 3-down back. That was definitely not true before. But other than him and, how pleasantly surprised we are that Flip Dixon has taken so well to this scheme, everybody else is basically just showing incremental progress, whether it be an Isaiah Washington who is just being a little bit more consistent than he's been, or the offensive line where I think every guy is a little better than they've been, but nobody is like went from nothing to, all Big Ten. I don't think anybody, maybe Holland Pierce, it has a chance at all Big Ten. I don't think anybody else deserves it, but they've all cohesively taken a step forward. And then on the same thing on the defense, like everybody is a little bit better or maybe a little healthier in the case of Toure than they were before. And even as much as we ragged on Max Melton earlier in the year for not being up to his potential, between him and Robert Longerbeam, Indiana had basically no chance of completing any significant play when they were in coverage. Like, they were glued to receivers in the last really 2 games. I mean, Michigan State, they were flagged a few times, but Indiana, their one big pass play was on a busted coverage. Like, they had no chance to complete some of those passes with Melton and Longerbeam playing that way. So, all those things are just a step. None of that was like a huge jump coming out of nowhere of a guy that we didn't expect. So that's actually more encouraging than if we're like, oh, we had the superstar on the bench we didn't know about type thing, fundamentally changing the team. So
go ahead. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say, I mean, who would you say has surprised you, or position group, or like what has surprised you the most as to how much better they are?
I would honestly say wide receiver. I was really concerned about wide receiver coming to the season. There was really no one proven at the FBS or Big Ten level. And, you lose Chris Long. Brantley hasn't even played. And the four guys that have played, they've been pretty solid. They haven't been, explosive or fantastic, but they've been pretty reliable. I mean, Christian Dremel has
For
been
sure.
extremely reliable in the slot and has really progressed. He jumped off that spring where he was the most improved offensive player. He's become real clutch. Isaiah Washington is definitely a guy that has been very inconsistent in his career, and I thought he's had some really nice moments this year where he stepped up. I mean, obviously that touchdown against Michigan State, but he's made some really tough catches this year. Ian Strong's got a ton of potential and has shown flashes at times, and then Jaquay Jackson obviously is the most explosive receiver and hasn't been as consistent, but as a group they've been pretty competent. And I didn't. They did have, I think, 3 drops against Indiana, but going into that game, they had only had 5 drops for the whole. Well, they averaged 5 drops. There was 5 drops for the whole. It was a really low stat.
For the
Getting my numbers
receivers, for the wide receiver group.
for the wide receivers in terms of drops for the season was rather low. So they've been pretty solid, and I think that was certainly a concern in terms of Wimsatt being able to take the next step, the offense taking the next step, and I think as a whole they've been pretty good.
Yeah, I would say that we talked about in the preseason, like, is this last year's linebackers? Where can they just patch it together enough to get through a year? And so far, the answer is yes.
Mm-hmm.
Even with, like you said, really only 4 guys have been playing, and at times they're only going with 3. Like, I mean, other than Christian Dremel, the other 3 guys have had times where they don't see the field for long stretches.
Yeah.
So yeah, I guess you could say Dremel, but I guess in my mind, since he had already won the most improved player maybe 2 different times, that would indicate to me that he's consistently been getting better. But now is finally their opportunity where they can run enough, their quarterback's good enough, and their offensive line's good enough for you to see what he can do. Whereas in other situations, even if he was as good as he is now, this is Dremel. Let's say it was 2 years ago or 5 years ago, like I don't think we would be seeing this type of production. So it's really a testament to the team around him when you can be in a position for a guy like that to flourish that we haven't seen from a Rutgers slot receiver in a long, long time. So I've been pleasantly surprised with that. And then the offensive line. I mean, I think I might have said this already, but every guy is better than they've been. And if there's anything that I'm most surprised about in college football as a whole this year, it's how quickly you can turn around your offensive line, almost to the point that if your offensive line's not good, you should just fire your coach immediately and get a new one and just see if you can improve it. Because, yeah, I mean, Indiana, like I said, their offensive line was a lot better than they've been the last 2 years with a new coach and basically the same personnel. And Rutgers went from being worse than Indiana's offensive line like 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago, to being equal or better, just with basically one new coach and the same players. So I would say that's been very impressive. And you might have another guest coming up on the podcast, so I wanted you to ask about like how things have changed from the blocking standpoint, because this team is just locked in at all positions from the blocking standpoint. But that in itself wouldn't be enough to win a lot of games. I mean, any other thoughts on the offense with like ceilings or X factors that haven't hit yet, or should we talk about the defense?
Well, before we go to the defense, the thing I wanted to say is I do think that, with both position groups that you've seen, again, no one's jumped out, but everyone's gotten a little bit better. And as a whole, the groups have gotten better. It goes back to coaching, right? I mean, Dave Brock and Pat Flaherty, I think it's obvious with both position groups that they've had a major impact this season being there, both, tremendous resumes, great experience. And I think that you're seeing the impact that they're making with the fundamentals, just with the consistency, in both areas. And I think, the blocking part, and I will have a partial answer for you because the guest, definitely kept the company line. But
Okay.
I think what I got from it was that, it is like they're all pulling the same way. And that's not a blocking, pun, but it's really more just like they're all bought in. And I think you're seeing that on offense with everyone is a willing blocker. On defense, everyone is swarming to the ball, and I think that has been a huge part of it where this team has energy and urgency on the field like the whole game. Where we have, there's been years past where we've talked offline, we haven't even said it, out loud, where like, they kind of, not everybody was still going hard in that game, or they said
Right,
teams
right.
that faded, or depth wise they were beat up. I mean, the defense was on the field 40 minutes, they're worn down. You're not seeing that impact, and the offense just being, I don't know if we can call them average. They have some things they do well, they have some things they have to do a lot better. I think I would call them average because they do, like, they can really run the ball, or they have against inferior defenses. But I think the fact that they're able to be competent, it's allowing the defense to stay healthier, to stay fresher, to have more of an impact and be more consistent than we've seen in years past.
Right, and when you take it from the other side, when I was listening to some of the aftermath from Indiana blogs and podcasts, things like that, the thing they just kept harping on was like our defense was exhausted. Theirs, right? The Indiana defense,
Mm-hmm.
Rutgers, they just kept harping like these guys were gassed because Rutgers just kept holding on to the ball. And the way you do that is you can't have drive killing penalties. You want to hit people out in every play, even if it's a pass, right? Like we talked about, you're making it difficult on them if you're kind of going forward and popping a guy, even if it's a quick pass or something like that. So just the fact that we're not on the receiving end of our defense being on the field for 35, 40 minutes, even the NCAA record for time on the field in that game against Michigan State a few years ago, when Michigan State had the ball for like 49 of the 60 minutes against Rutgers. I
Yeah.
mean, nothing like that. So the other thing about being buttoned up, and this is kind of out of left field, is I think I sent Aaron I sent you the comment about the Iowa game and about how when they returned that punt for touchdown and it was called back, they still had the ball at midfield with a minute left in a timeout at home. And all they had to do was get about 20, maybe 15 yards to attempt a game winning field goal because they were down 12-10 and they have a good kicker. They got a good snapper, right? And yet their fans, nobody in the stadium thought that they were going to move that ball 15 to 20 yards. No one. And they had a minute to do it, one timeout, right, at home. So that wasn't like crowd noise was going to be a problem. And so Rutgers, even though, has been ranked this year coming into last week, we are above that in terms of, what our level is on offense. Now, do I think that they're a top tier of the Big Ten offense? No. They're pretty much middle of the pack ceiling and middle of the pack floor. And what I mean by that is like there are teams that can flash more on offense, like a Purdue, but there's also situations where Purdue can't do anything. We've
Yeah.
seen very few times where Rutgers couldn't do anything. Even against Michigan, they were moving the ball a little bit. Even against Wisconsin, you throw a pick six when you're at the 5-yard line, right? Like they had moved the ball some. I know that they had a couple 3-and-outs in the first half,
Yeah.
but with the
That was
offense,
probably the only time, though. That first half before that was the only time. You're right. They haven't been able to do anything.
right? So, I mean, it'll be interesting to see. I think um, there's really two times that you really find out what your capabilities are. One is just out of necessity, like your quarterback gets hurt and you got to play the backup, and you find out, or a running back or a receiver gets hurt and you're like, well, we got to see what the next guy up can do. And then the other time is when you're in effect playing with house money, right? And I think the analogy is actually perfect because when you're in a poker match and you've already got your money back for that game that day, you can say, okay, maybe I'll go with these cards or something like that. In the case of football, it's like, okay, maybe we'll let Gavin throw a route that he says he feels comfortable with, but we're not comfortable with him doing it. Okay, maybe we try it, right? Maybe we're down by 17 to Ohio State in the fourth quarter. We got to try something that they haven't seen on film. Maybe you try it, and maybe it works. Probably won't, but these are the opportunities that they've given themselves in the second half of the year. Similar with personnel, that if you don't want to play your guys too many snaps, and you can see what a guy can do against an Ohio State or a Penn State, and not have to feel the pressure of like, we need to try everything we can to win this game. I'm not saying they're not trying to win, but I'm saying that they're more willing to roll the dice and
Yeah.
see if something sticks than feel like we have to play our best 11 on defense the entire game. And if they're all hurt by the end, like, so be it. They're not in that position. And that's when you can find out, like, hey, we have this guy who hasn't been playing, or he can do something he hasn't been doing, and go from there. So that's probably what I'm most excited to see as it kind of transfers into the second now of the season, because we're going to get a bonus month. We're really, calendar-wise halfway through the games at this point. So that's what I'm
Right.
most excited to see. Are there other things that you think maybe this team hasn't hit their ceiling, or even if it doesn't work, that we might see them try and at least we'll find out?
Well, I think to your point about trying new things, I do think mentality wise, I think it could help this team being loose. They've checked off that big box, and playing with house money, I think is true. Obviously, they want to win every week, but like even Ohio State playing them later in the season is different. And they probably, you could argue. I mean, you have to look back at the schedule, but this is probably the most confidence they'll ever have going into Ohio State that they've had so
Maybe
far.
2014, maybe.
Yeah, maybe that was blind. It was like
True.
being a rookie, you don't know any better. But yeah, so I think that they have confidence. They have the relief of knowing that worst case scenario. You go 0 for November, and I know they don't look at it that way. They go week to week, but still, they have the security of knowing they have that extra month booked. They know they're going to go to the postseason, and it's really just about letting it all out there. And yeah, I hope that does translate to the coaching a little bit. I would like to see them take some more chances. I think I know everyone's upset about Wims's inaccuracy, and he certainly has made some poor throws, but he's also made some throws that we haven't seen a Rutgers quarterback make in a long time. And I would just like to see. I do think that part of it is rhythm. I think that like Indiana game, it was 24 of the first 27 snaps were runs. So I get it. He's the quarterback. He should be able to make throws, at any time. But I think for his development, and it goes back to Northwestern, I thought they did a fantastic job of structuring the play calling in the beginning to get him the best out of him and to build his confidence. And I don't think they've actually been able to replicate that since. And part of that is the game plan is going to be different game to game and your opponent. But yeah, I mean, if they just try to run it up the gut against Ohio State, we know that's probably not going to work very well. They're going to have to do some kind of wrinkle to make it interesting. And like you said, why not make it interesting? Because if they lose 49-0, I know fans, I already getting comments like people are upset. They're on national TV because they don't want, national people to turn on the score and see them down big and think, oh, Rutgers stinks. I don't think you can think that way. I think it's an opportunity. I think this team will play loose. I hope the coaching staff follows suit and they do switch things up a little bit, and we see a little bit of maybe not a different approach, but a change in how they're attacking things from kind of a balanced perspective, because Ohio State's not going to be thrown off by the fact that they're going to try to run 80% of the time. That's
right.
I just don't see that working.
Yeah, and I think that there's really two parts of it. Like I was saying, I'm not saying fundamentally completely shift your philosophy or put guys in the game who aren't as good as the players that are better. If a guy is a better player, put him in. I'm more saying that, and I know you're not putting these words in my mouth, this is me clarifying, is more that there are things you may not have tried, or and the reason you haven't done it, and you see this a lot in baseball now, where managers just make the decision that's defensible, right? Well, I went with this guy because he's hitting 300 on grass at night against left-handed pitching or whatever. And it's like, if you hadn't reached bowl eligibility, and let's say you're Tom Allen for Indiana, you have to do things that look defensible to your donors, and so people don't just think you're talking smack, right? So you have to do things that are not maybe what your hunch is telling you will work, because either analytics or some other force is telling you, I have to be able to defend this decision. And that's one of the reasons why I think Soraka has been effective, is because even we have been critical of him, or the media or the fans, he doesn't care. And then the next game, they have a different game plan, and then they execute. And so that's why we've kind of been on this roller coaster where it's like, okay, lose to Indiana, or I'm sorry, lose to Wisconsin, then you come back and win 2 games. Or, they lost to Michigan and they didn't let them lose. They didn't lose that game twice, basically. Right. And so I think that when you don't have this added pressure coming from the outside that, I need to be able to justify, every single decision I made, it lets you kind of lean on things that you might not have done so. So that would be one part of it. And then the other part of it is, as we've seen time and time again, and I've watched a lot of Big Ten football that's not Rutgers, and that when you come into the game and you think, okay, we're just going to play it safe and running up the gut against Michigan, Penn State, and Ohio State, you think you're only going to lose 30-0 because you're going to play a conservative. That rarely is true. Rarely. That might be true against Iowa because just if you shorten the game, their offense isn't going to score a lot of points. That you're more likely to lose 20-0 than 35-6 or something. But against the big boys, you have to push the envelope. And it's a logical fallacy to think that you're going to have a better shot to even keep it close if you're not the aggressor. And I talked about this with Michigan, which is like they're scheming for you. Obviously, this whole signal, this stealing signs scandal, I don't really want to get into it, but the point is that they have their personnel, they trust their personnel. So you have the opportunity to be the aggressor and say, okay, I'm going to try to get this matchup that we want, or we know they're going to play a cover 2 in this look, and we know that if we throw it into this spot, it might be successful, right? And so you have to take those chances, or not only will you not win, you're more likely to get just completely destroyed. It's just fake to think that you're going to run into the line. I mean, we saw Rutgers against Michigan. Like, they were stopping the run with 7. They didn't need extra blitzers. Sometimes they were stopping the run with 6 guys. And the Ohio State defense has been better than they've been. They might be as good as Michigan. Probably not, but it's going to be close. Same thing with Penn State. I mean, they kept Ohio State down. So you're going to have to do those things, and it actually gives your team confidence, and it makes it less likely. It also makes your opponent respect you more. And I think that that's a huge thing that has played into their success this year, is that if Indiana didn't respect the pass, they would have put 9 guys in the box the other day. And they might not have been able to execute, but they respected it enough that they weren't going to lose because, a guy was wide open deep with no safety. Because, again, their coaches was like, we can't lose because of that. That would be an indefensible thing to do. But also because, they did respect Rutgers enough. And so I'm curious to see how these next few games play out. But it would be good to see somebody else emerge, even if they're not a starter, even if they're not like an all Big Ten performer, but maybe another tight end or another linebacker. Now that Powell's out, Ray Collins is suspended for the first half. Like, who can just be another guy that you can go into next year saying, okay, we got one more guy that we have confidence. If he has to start, he'll be a valuable contributor. Like, those are some of the things I'm looking at from a tactical standpoint, and then what might be the result of it, even if it's not victories. I mean, are you thinking anything else going into these last few games? Is there a guy you expect to kind of pop, or a position group, or anything like that as we head to the back stretch?
Yeah, so you just made me think of something that I have been thinking about all year, and and it kind of goes back to the stability, the steadiness, but think about Wimsatt specifically, right? He had some bad throws against Indiana, but when it was that 4th down and he had to make a throw, he made the throw perfectly to Dremel for the first down, and they ended up the game, scored on that drive, and the game pretty much wasn't over, but it was going in the right direction. He had confidence Rutgers was going to win the game. There's been so many times this year where Rutgers has missed on plays, but like when they had to have a play, when they had to come through, they've come through. Michigan State several times. But even going back to Virginia Tech,
Temple.
Yeah, Temple, when it was close in the 4th quarter and they blew him out of the water. Virginia Tech, when Monungai had that 50-yard touchdown run, when Virginia Tech had it to 1 score. It was like whenever they had to come through for a play against these teams, they were able to do it. And I think that is just like a trait of this team that is super encouraging, because it's not just about not making mistakes. You can't win just not making mistakes. You have to make plays too. So I think in combination and being able to do both has been a huge growth development. And again, we've talked about, maybe a lack of explosiveness, maybe even on defense. They haven't forced a ton of turnovers. They've definitely been better. They haven't gotten a ton of interceptions. They've been pretty good on forcing fumbles and things like that. Sacks have gone down a little bit of late, but they haven't given up a lot of sacks at all. But yeah, so I think that growth as a team is really encouraging. And then, defensively with Powell out now, it's going to be really interesting because I don't think it's just about linebacker. We were talking about this offline and I posted an article on it. But like for me, a guy that I've been super high on that I think could actually emerge now and get more time, and it kind of fits into what maybe they're going to need if they do slide Teray more into that traditional linebacker spot now, which I don't think they will exclusively, but I think they will at times for sure, is Kenny Fletcher. I think he's a guy that could really get more opportunity now in bigger spots. Who's a guy that I think, has a really bright future with this team. And he's been limited a little bit because Teray has been back and has been able to, be versatile in how they utilize him. And I think Fletcher's a guy for me that I'm looking at. Everybody's probably going to say Moses Walker, and Shiano talked about him today. He hasn't played since the Temple game, and Shiano said he's
And
getting better.
he's been playing on special teams, but he hasn't played on defense.
Right. So he hasn't played on defense at all since the Temple game. They said he's getting better. He's getting better, and maybe he will get an opportunity now. But for me, Fletcher's been a guy that I don't think he hasn't played because they don't necessarily think that he can help. I think it's just been having the opportunity to do it. So he's a guy I'm looking at that could walk through the door and really play a bigger role now moving forward, and offers them. He's not Mohamed Touré, but he has a lot of upside on the edge.
Yeah. I mean, I think the big thing, and we'll probably get into this in subsequent weeks, is like, what are their options there? Do they end up, they have options, I guess would be say. Like
Yes.
maybe it's linebacker and Touré plays edge. Maybe Touré plays linebacker and you get Fletcher or Jordan Thompson's earn more snaps. I mean, I would say maybe, then you can feel even more confident playing Aaron Lewis inside more often. Mm-hmm. Right? These are all possibilities, especially with Conga out. Right? I mean, they have options. And the question is, who do you figure out can do it rather than just saying, okay, we're going to line up with, Ahanotu, Rainey, and Hamilton, two of those three guys inside, Bailey, and which you can't because he's been hurt too. And Lewis outside, Touré, and Jennings, and that's it. That's what we're rolling with. We'll see what they can do, but they should have more options available to them.
Well, and going into this stretch now, you're playing better competition, right? They can't just play 7 guys.
Right.
Like they have to get other guys reps. And I think to your point, you have the freedom to do that now because you have those 6 wins. So of course you want to, play to win, but at the same time, you have to look big picture now because you do have 2 months to go. You're not playing for, you're not wondering if you're going to go past Thanksgiving. You can strategize now in terms of if there's any redshirt decisions, but also just health wise in terms of getting guys reps, not just, overdoing it with maybe a certain position or player, whatnot. But I think that is an asset too, that they know that now. It speaks to the growth of the program that they, even though, they have some key guys out now with Conga and Powell, Bailey's been, banged up. He's played every game, but he's missed some time. They still have enough options out there to be able to make different decisions. So I think that's been huge. And another quality, and I feel like we can do a whole episode on this, but like there is some parallels, and I know people don't always like to compare football to basketball, but it is starting to remind me a little bit of like how Pikel built the program. Where like look at Hinspetter, right? I mean, like Hinspetter will he actually start against Ohio State? It's possible. He had 3 tackles against Indiana on 15 snaps, a walk on, but it's like you're building the schemes, you're building the structure, you're building the culture, and then Sean's just going to keep adding more talent to the team now. And that's exactly what Pikel did. He instilled his system. He instilled his, defensive mentality, and he's just added talent to the roster year over year, and they keep getting better. And I feel like football, we're seeing like they're winning they have more talent, they have more depth, but not to the point where, we're talking about a top half Big Ten team like year to year yet. But I think they're getting to that point potentially. But we're seeing that guys are making winning plays that were unheralded, and that is obviously a Shiano, staple from before. But there is a nice blend of guys that are high impact players, but also, again, like Dremel, former walk on, and now you have Hinspetter that potentially could play, a bigger role as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Hinspetter thing. He's the third part of the trio with Dremel and Monangai from Don Bosco Prep.
Yep.
Right, which is, and this is going to sound negative, but I'm not sure if any of those guys would really do much of anything if they were playing on, let's say, a 2019 Rutgers squad. Like but when you have these other guys around you that are, have the length, have the speed, and then you can kind of balance out the skill versus the speed of those guys, then they can shine, right? And it's what's crazy about it is, let's say, look at Isaiah Pacheco. He's having more success in the NFL than he did at Rutgers. Yeah. And that's a guy that ran a 4.3, bench press a ton of weight, a physical beast. But the fact that you have this team around you is the biggest difference, right? Yes. Between what he's able to do. So Hinspetter, we would never find out how good he really was in the past, but maybe we're at a point now where he can play, and maybe he becomes a starter. Like Brendan Ranker was like, I'm not even sure if he was on scholarship, but a guy like that was able to play on those good Rutgers teams, and then he played in the NFL,
Yeah.
right? It's entirely possible that walk-ons, even like a Dremel, I mean, Chris Hogan from Wyckoff, I think it's Chris Hogan, right?
Yeah.
He played in the NFL, and he
Yeah.
wasn't,
He
he
was a
wasn't
lacrosse guy.
right. Like, but because he played for teams that he was able to improve and physically develop over time, he got these opportunities. So yeah, I mean, we didn't even get really to talk about special teams, but I know we're kind of running out of time for this episode. Perhaps we'll talk about that next week as a huge X factor. But anything else you want to say at this point in the season, other than that we're happy and we're now members of the Fansville community, probably for the first time since they had the campaign.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's gradual progress, and like I've seen some gripes. So, well, Rutgers hasn't beaten anyone. Well, it's a huge step that they've beaten everybody they're supposed to. That they've beaten everybody they've been favored to. I mean, how many years have we lamented, a game that Rutgers was supposed to win that they blew,
Well,
right? So I think,
first you gotta beat nobody before you
yeah,
beat somebody,
yeah,
and you gotta beat nobody before they weren't beating anybody before. Like they didn't winning games.
right,
Then you got to
right.
win against teams that aren't good before you can win against teams that are good.
Well, and people also forget, like, like in college football, like you win 6, 7 games, like you could still have plenty of flaws. Like you're not,
Oh yeah,
this isn't the NFL, and that's okay. Like this team has there's competency on this team across the board that hasn't been there probably since Shiano's first tenure. I guess you
probably
could say 2014, but that might have been a little bit of a lightning in the bottle situation. Coming into the Big Ten, kind of unknown, haven't been
right,
scouted before. I'm not like trying to diminish what that team accomplished, but just in terms of everything kind of clicking at once, things are
right,
really starting to gel. And I think that's exciting that we all had hoped it would happen the fourth year, but there was fair reasons to be concerned and doubt that it would actually happen. So the fact that it actually has happened, is really encouraging. And I think that these next 2 months are huge, just not only for this season, of course, but for next season and beyond, just in terms of locking up a recruiting class, developing the younger guys. You're going to get those extra practices now with the bowl week or bowl game.
right.
And I think that people have to remember, like, and we were looking at some of the rankings. I know we didn't go too much into it, but yeah, this team's in the 40s to 50 range, in terms of college football. But I mean, when was the last time they were? It was
Right.
years. So
There's a lot of times we see 80s, 90s when I was looking
yes,
back at it. We'll get into that later in the year, just crunching those numbers. But yeah, for sure.
yes. Yeah, we'll have plenty to talk about, especially if it's after a loss to Ohio State or whatever. But I think, listen, there's 2 winnable games still on the table. Iowa and Maryland, I think, are definitely winnable. I don't think they'll be favored. I don't think you
They
could say
should
they're.
be. Right.
What's that?
I don't think they should be favored.
No. I
Right.
think probably in the 30 to 40% chance range. But that's encouraging, and you have 2 games that you're probably going to take your licking. But I'm curious to see how they compete in those games. Like Rutgers has gotten blown out in the trenches against Penn State the last few years. Like, can
Right.
they actually take that step and like be competitive for a good part of that game? Ohio State has athletes all over the place. This isn't their most explosive offense. Like Rutgers can they keep it interesting? I think they can. So I think that and we know Pro Football Focus is the hardest schedule left in college football. So expectations have to be tempered, but they can absolutely win a bowl game. They could steal a game against Iowa or Maryland, and I think if let's just say they won 2 out of the last 5. I mean, I don't think realistically you could ask for a better finish.
Absolutely not. Looking forward to it.
All right. Anything else before we go? I kind of stole your thunder there.
No. That was mostly what I was going to say. And I'm just, again, happy that we're having these conversations and we're not just already talking about signing day, because that means that, fans have a reason to be encouraged and not be too discouraged if a couple of these games don't go their way over the next few weeks.
Yes. And last thing, if anyone does decommit, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem, right? I mean, it's
Right.
college football right now, and regionality. I think it's going to be. I think one thing we didn't really touch on is winning now and going to a bowl game with having so many recruits all over the country and not so Jersey centric is even more important, because now you kind of keep the interest level, and people can't really negatively recruit against Rutgers right now. All the Florida recruits they have, you can't really go to them and say, well, Rutgers isn't good. Why are you going all the way to Jersey? Now you have Rutgers 6-2. They're going to a bowl game. So I think for the recruiting class, sticking them together, it's key. But I think, we might see some attrition there in the recruiting class a little bit. But overall, I am curious to see if they have any late pickups now that could benefit from the way they're playing.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think the main thing is just there shouldn't be a mass exodus. If
No.
you lose a guy or two here or there, so
Yeah.
be it. But in general, onward and upward. And one thing that I think is its own separate episode, if you invite me for it, would be talking about over the history of the last, let's say, 30, 40 years, certain things have broken Rutgers' favor when they've been good, which allowed them to get into the Big East, allowed them to get into the Big Ten, whereas other things haven't. Let's say the downturn in the 90s when a lot of those games were televised. Like, there's a lot of those things that we can talk. Streaming, right? When the streaming first started, they were not good. How did that impact the program? It's probably its own discussion. But right now, with the way things are changing super quick, it's a good time to be one of your better seasons in recent memory is this year, especially with the
Absolutely.
uncertainty around the sport.
Definitely. And I think also being at year 4, Shiano, you don't want to go into year 5 with still people asking questions. You even have, Stuart Mandel, saying, "Oh, Rutgers is 6-2." So, and by the way, he did not retract what he said. So I don't like that people are letting him off the hook. He did not, retract the most ridiculous statement ever. But we can get into that another time too. Thank you so much for being back, David Anderson. Enjoy the bye weekend, and we'll talk soon.
Thanks.